Thank you very much, Juristen. Thank you very much, first of all, to the Norwegian Democrats for the invitation and for making this important event possible. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that re-migration is necessary, and I don't need to prove this to this audience. But the greatest danger to our cause is not its opponents. It is the temptation to mistake the tool for the goal. For whoever believes that re-migration alone can answer Europe's crisis has not yet seen how deep this crisis truly runs. Re-migration is a tool. Through it, order can be restored, state control regained, and dangerous developments can be corrected. What it cannot do is restore the very thing whose loss made it necessary in the first place. It treats the symptom, not the disease. So two questions stand before us today, at least from my perspective. How could Europe reach the point where such a tool became unavoidable? And secondly, what comes after order has been restored? So, for whoever answers the first question and forgets the second, wins of order, but maybe lose an entire civilization. And before we speak about what threatens Europe, I think it's essential to recall what Europe is supposed to be. So today, we describe Europe and our continent as an economic area, a single market or a framework of treaties. That is not wrong, but it falls short. It's only the scaffolding which is mistaken for the building. Let me call a witness whom no one can dismiss as one of our own. It's Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, founder of modern Turkey, observing Europe from the outside, once said that there are many cultures, but only one civilization, the European one. From a distance, he recognized what many Europeans longer do not see up and close. A continent that fuses freedom, reason, law, faith, and historical continuity into a single civilizational form. This form was not designed by ministry. It grew over centuries. Greece, for example, gave us philosophy and the foundations of rational thought. Rome created law and the architecture of the state. For 1,000 years, one second, I think there's a little problem there. Yeah, it's vanishing somewhere. So, it grew over centuries. Greece, as I said, gave us the philosophy. Rome created the law. And for thousands of years, Christian Europe shaped a shared moral consciousness from which arose our cathedrals, our universities, our music, our art, and without equal, I have to say, to human history. What held this together was never administration alone. It was the awareness among very different people of who they were and where they came from. And here lies the insight that we've lost. A civilization does not live by laws and institutions alone. Law presupposes order. Politics presupposes responsibility. Freedom presupposes self-restraint. Belonging presupposes identity. And these are not theories, but historically demonstrable facts. Rome rotted from within through the loss of civic virtue and the preference for bread and gains over duty, until what came from outside met an inside that was already hollow. When large parts of society come to see their own borders as a moral problem, equate cultural self-assertion with intolerance, and feel the defense of national interests as shameful, the inner legitimacy to enforce order fades. The true surrender, therefore, did not happen at the out of order. It happened in the consciousness of European societies. The day that they decided they were no longer entitled to remain themselves. No fence, no law, and not even re-migration can restore what was first broken in the realm of conviction. The tool restores the border. The will behind it can be restored only by a people. And now is the time for an unpleasant truth that might unsettle a few of you. The forces that systematically undermined Europe's self-confidence did not come from an external enemy. They came from within, from our own universities, our own media, and our own political class. Three currents worked together. The first supplied the theory. Antonio Gramsci understood that a civilization is conquered not first by force, but through the institutions that shape its spirit. He called this cultural hegemony. What Rudi Dutschke later called the long march through the institutions became the blueprint for a whole generation. The second carried it into practice. What began in the late 1960s as a student revolt became far more than a quarrel with authority. Nations, family, and traditions were recast as repression, as backwardness, as an instrument of oppression. The third carried it from the margins into the mainstream. Classical liberalism, once bound to responsibility, became hyper-individualism that regards every collective identity as a threat to the self. And together they created a new image detached from origin, from formation, from any history he had not chosen for himself. Nowhere did this take a sharper form than in Germany, where an artificial, inflated guilt replaced a healthy self-understanding with a permanent suspicion of every act of cultural self-assertion. Yet similar tendencies, however, emerged across Europe, each nation through its own historical burdens and narratives. Every nation carries difficult chapters, and an honest reckoning with them is absolutely necessary. But it turns destructive the moment it can no longer distinguish between responsibility and from the permanent relativizing of one's own existence. Such an emptiness never stays empty. It seeks a substitute, and substitutes stood ready, presenting themselves not as an opinion but as science, not as faith but as progress, claiming moral superiority and tolerating no dissent. I'm talking about identity politics, gender ideology, LGBTQ, activism, feminism, and so on and so forth. These served the very function once filled by tradition and our virtues. They offered belonging and meaning, but without historical or scientific depth or the responsibility towards the generations to come. The danger is not that such surrogates exist. It is that after years of re-education, people could no longer recognize their falseness and embrace them as liberation, while in truth they deepened the very uprooting that left them insecure and easy to steer. Alongside this ideological shift came a second loss, quieter but not less destructive. The moral framework that held Europe together for centuries, Christian heritage. I speak not of private piety or church-going, but of a civilizational force. Whatever Europe believed, or whatever European believes today, the European order did not arise detached from Christianity. For centuries it shaped our understanding of human nature and law, our notion of the family, our ethics of responsibility, duty, measure, self-discipline, reliability, and the common good were not accidental habits. As materialist and individualist worldviews spread, these foundations were relativized and portrayed as backward or as dispensable. Here, the telling imbalance shows itself. While Europe relativizes and mocks its own symbols, other religious communities hold theirs with far more confidence. A civilization no longer willing to honor its own foundations signals its inner weakness and should not be surprised when others occupy the space it has vacated. And where Europe retreats, a self-confident Islam, for example, encouraged by false tolerance, politics and the media steps into the spaces it leaves. This loss of substance did not stay confined to universities or the cultural debate. Over decades, it reshaped our political and media structures and opened a widening gap between those who decide and the reality of those decided over. A new political class arose, formed not by working life or experience outside the institutions, but by curricula saturated with ideology. The path of many fits a singular formula, from nursery to university to parliament. It raises a question rarely asked these days. What qualifications should political office require? In medicine, in law, in engineering, qualification is the precondition for bearing responsibility. In politics, the mere will to stand for election usually suffices. An office that demands no qualifications produces amateurs. And many decisions that seem irrational these days are less a matter of ill will than of complete and utter incompetence. Meanwhile, much of the media gave up its role as a check on power and became an actor itself, moving from reporting to moral judgment. Certain positions no longer counted as worthy of debate, but as inadmissible. From this grew manipulation of opinion as simple as it was effective. Real problems were softened in language, fenced in, and dismissed as those famous isolated cases that, to the media's annoyance, then suddenly happened on a daily basis. Whoever pointed to obvious tensions risked being declared the problem himself. The clearest example was the very word this conference is all about. In Germany, re-migration was declared the non-word of the year in 2023, not because it has been refuted, but because the images it revokes. Consider what that means. The problem is not discussed. The word that names the problem is declared the problem. And let me turn this question around. What is more unworthy of democracy? A term that names a demand, or a strategy that pushes the demand out of the public space through contrived moral condemnation? Whoever delegitimizes a term instead of answering it has already lost the argument and knows it. So let us do what they refuse and look at the matter plainly. Migration is as old as human history. What is new is its scale and the condition of the society receiving it. Its sheer magnitude today exceeds what any society can absorb and fit into its order, however self-confident this society might be. Integration on this scale is therefore not a difficult task, it is simply an illusion. And it did not need a cultural secure Europe, but one that had undermined its own foundations over decades and lost much of its power to integrate, no longer sure of the very culture into which others were meant to fit. Integration succeeded in the past only because it took place on a far smaller scale. And consider the Huguenots in Prussian Brandenburg. Three conditions came together: a limited number, cultural kinship, which is rather important, and a society sure of itself with a clear order to which the newcomers had to adapt to. Today, none of these holds, and where they are missing, the result is not integration, but fragmentation. Parallel structures in the growing sense that state control and lived reality are drifting further and further apart. Yet, whenever this drift is named honestly, a single word is turned against those who do so: tolerance. It never meant accepting every development without objection or surrendering the right to cultural self-assertion. It meant the capacity to endure differing positions within the stable order. It has become a one-sided demand, unconditionally towards minorities, restrictive towards the majority. And a democracy that places its own civic majority behind every other claim undermines, in the long run, its legitimacy and actually its right to exist. Now we can say clearly what re-migration is and what it is not. It is the orderly political answer to a long loss of control. It rests on the principle that no civilization may surrender, that a sovereign people decides who becomes a permanent part of its society and who does not. Whoever is here illegally must leave. Whoever commits serious crimes, whoever brings violence and extremism into our countries must leave. And whoever openly rejects and fights our culture, our history, and our order can never remain a part of our societies. And precisely for that reason, remigration is not hatred. It is not revenge, but it is not extremism. It is the legitimate attempt to stop the far advanced decay of values before it becomes irreversible. But remember the sentence with which I began. Remigration restores order. It cannot restore the binding force whose absence first created the disorder. It is the tool, not the task. In that regard, I must speak honestly about the limits of politics. For every movement is tempted to promise that the right policies will suffice. Well, they do not. Because politics can secure borders and enforce order, but it cannot legislate a culture back into being. Identity cannot be restored by a resolution, nor cohesion by statute. History confirms it. Societies that lost their cultural foundation rarely recovered through political reforms alone. Lasting renewal began wherever cultural and spiritual movements reached deeper than party programs and rekindled a people's awareness of their roots. This is why this present crisis is at its core one of education and of culture. Cultural education is not refinement for a few. It is a bulwark against the dissolution of the individual into a faceless mass. Culture is not a declaration around political life, but the inner substance from which it springs. And this is why it is perhaps also our strongest weapon, and why those who would dissolve Europe have worked so hard and so long to detach our people from their history and cultural identity. But the second question still stands. What comes once order has been restored and remigration carried out in full? Would our universities suddenly recover their purpose? Would our schools form character again rather than merely pass on half-baked information to our children? Would our media remember suddenly their responsibility? Would Europe suddenly recall who it is? Well, of course not. For the crisis did not begin with migration, and it will not end with remigration. The same fragmented society would remain. The same cultural insecurity would remain. The same moral disorientation would remain. The symptom would be corrected, and the underlying condition would not. And that leads us to an even harder question. Is remigration even possible without cultural and moral renewal? For remigration is no mere execution of a bureaucratic procedure. It is the political act of self-preservation. And such an act demands something Europe increasingly lacks these days: conviction. It demands a population willing to defend its own continuity, a political class willing to act against resistance, institutions willing to enforce hard decisions. And above all, it demands a people still sure enough of its own civilization to believe that preserving it is both legitimate and right. Yet that certainty is exactly what has been worn away from us for decades. A society taught to see its history first as a catalog of guilt will hesitate to defend it. A civilization persuaded that its identity is interchangeable will not trouble to preserve it. For a people that has lost faith in itself cannot sustain the will to act, and without that will, even the most urgent measures slip beyond reach. This is why cultural renewal is not only what follows remigration, it is one of the conditions that makes remigration possible after all. And so, of the two questions I raised, and the second is not the lesser. It is the one we actually must answer first. Yet the civilization is not measured by the sharpness with which it describes its own decline, but by the clarity with which it knows how to stop it. Renewal does not arise in ministries nor in parliaments. It arises where the identity is first formed. In families, in schools, in universities, in our art, music, and especially in the stories that one generation passes on to the next. And let us have a little bit of fantasy here now. Picture a young European standing for the first time beneath the vault of a soaring cathedral, realizing that no foreign hand built it but the hand of his ancestors, who hears the swelling chorus of Beethoven's Ninth and feels something answers within him that he never learned and yet always carried inside, who immerses himself in Goethe's Faust and discovers that its greatness opens only to those who have learned once again to understand a demanding language. From such encounters comes no imposed doctrine, but a recognition that transforms him from within. Step by step, he ceases to be a guest in his own history and becomes its heir. Whoever has once walked this path can no longer be uprooted, for he knows what he grew from. And this is why U-Turn for Europe was created. That is another party dedicated to a cultural and civilizational renewal, beginning where politics cannot reach. This is no program for distant days. Our conference on values in Vienna in spring brought together representatives from already 14 countries of Europe and seeks answers to cultural and spiritual decline, and we started to put things into action. We are building educational and artistic initiatives, national branches across the continent with already 7 underway, and a think tank of Europe for Europe's cultural, social, and ethical questions. What this stands for can be also soon experienced in a single evening. Our project Ode to Europe, premiering in Vienna at the end of 2026, brings together the music of our classical composers such as Bach or Haydn, the words of classical poets like Schiller or Dante, and images of the magnificent beauty of our continent. The point is not to keep culture under glass, but to let it sound, shine, and speak again. For a civilization that recognizes its poets, its music, and its art as its own has begun to rediscover its own greatness. So we come to the decisive question of the time. It is not which party governs, which coalition holds tomorrow, or which headline dominates the next news cycle. What is truly at stake is whether Europe still wants to remain Europe at all. We are no longer in an ordinary political dispute. We are in a civilizational struggle over the future of our continent, of our nations, and Europe's will to defend its own identity. But perhaps this is our deepest tragedy. No external power could ever have defeated Europe for good had Europe not first began to dissolve itself from within. And yet, I do not believe that Europe is lost. History is not a fate to which one must submit. Nations have renewed themselves again and again, whenever the peoples refused to yield to decline. That refusal is awakening all over Europe and all over our continent in these days. The longing for belonging, for continuity, for a place that truly is one's own has not vanished. It cannot be regulated away or extinguished by ideologies, for it lies at the foundation of a human community. And this is why our civilization still has a chance to determine its own destiny. We get here today over Re-migration, and yes, we need it, the sooner the better. But what truly unites us is far greater than a single demand. It is the recognition that Europe is more than a market or a bureaucratic structure. Europe is our home, the place that gave the word civilization its meaning, for which generations before us worked, fought, and made sacrifices. And we have no right to let it crumble without resistance. For one day, people will look back on our time and simply ask a question. Where were you when Europe began to give itself up? Did you stay silent? Did you conform? Or did you begin to root yourself once more in your own culture? This, then, is not political. It is, first and foremost, a matter of responsibility, of character, and of courage. And every generation is given its task, and I believe ours is to remind Europe of who it is. and to lay bare its roots again, to win back its identity, to halt the cultural decay and reverse it entirely. It will not be easy, there will be resistance, there will be defamations and attacks, as we can see outside. Yet every great cultural renewal in history began with people willing to stand against the current of their time. And we will continue this work, culturally, spiritually, politically, until Europe remembers what it once was and what it will become again. Our home, with our rules, our values, and our traditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Just a heads up before we go into the break. The pamphlet, the brochure which Stefan has made is, what should I say, an extended version of the speech again. It can be bought at the back for the mere sum of 100 krona. And what time is it now? Let's see. It is. We'll take a break until 17:45. So 22 minutes. We're on a break. 17.